The boys traversed their own barricades and took positions behind Bran and Patrick on the stage. Only Elijah made any noise, and it didn't escape Bran's notice that he still looked weak and wrung out. But he didn't have a choice, and even wounded and exhausted, he could probably still do more damage than Bran could with this damn pistol. Shay stood between and slightly behind Bran and Patrick, Kat and her boys right behind her, like an old-timey pikeman, ready to spike anything that got in too close. Then the devil came into the sanctuary, and hell followed with him. Chapter 19. If you ever needed proof that the primals held on to a disconcerting level of human cunning, it was clear in what they did next. A single bark shattered the silence, distinctly commanding, and as one, every single window grate sprouted clawed fingers and was ripped out of their frames as easily as though they were simple insect screens. 4 windows on the right, 4 windows on the left, primals leaping through all 8. Patrick's rifle roared, sending one of the closest primals spinning and yowling the instant its feet hit the sanctuary floor. He racked the lever as he pivoted, fired again, shattering Bran's eardrums and taking the next closest primal as it tried to hurdle the pews to their left. Bran's finger tightened on the trigger, but held back before breaking it. He knew he couldn't hit a damn thing until they were closer. Let Patrick hit the ones at range. Bran would save his 15 rounds for the ones that made it past the last pews. Then, from the farthest window on the right, a massive shape came tumbling through. Khan. Big black. It seemed like he was all Bran could see. The huge beast immediately charged, and Bran reflexively pulled the trigger. He was shocked as hell to see Khan's shoulder jerk as he tore down the sanctuary towards them on all 4s. But Bran knew better than to press his luck, and despite the fact that there were primals coming at them from all directions, Bran didn't dare take his sights off of Khan. Patrick was firing and levering his rifle with manic speed, slowing the advance of the other primals, but not stopping it. Still, Bran held back, knowing he'd need every single round left in the pistol to hit Khan's center mass if he had any hope of not dying in the next 3 seconds. Shay was screaming at him, telling him to shoot. Not yet. Khan leapt the first row of pews as though the bullet hole Bran had put in him were nothing more than a bug bite. Now Patrick was yelling at him too. Bran was screaming as well, but without any words. Khan practically glided across the barricades, scrabbling effortlessly across the tops of the tangled pews, now on the last barricade and about to leap. Now! Shoot him now! Give him everything you— Bran got exactly 2 rounds off. Couldn't miss, Khan was so close at that point. Except that his aim was shoved wide by a muscular brown arm, as Elijah shot around Bran and leapt to meet his father, the 2 big males crashing together in midair with a bone-crunching wallop and a gust of expended lungs. From either side of Bran, the hybrids hurled themselves into the fray, the lot of them screeching like banshees, except for Kat. She just plunged in with her teeth bared. Or maybe it was a grin. For the span of a single second, Bran was struck dumb by the marvel of Kat in action. He'd seen her kill with her bare hands, but those had all been the poor human bastards they'd been sent to murder, who could mount only the most pitiful defense. Bran had never seen her actually fight. She went straight for the biggest glut of primals, 4 of them churning towards the stage, only a few strides to Bran's left. Kat leapt as she closed, catching the closest one with a knee to its face that rocked its head back in a spray of blood and teeth and rearranged facial features. She twisted in midair, both hands shooting out to seize the throat of the next, not just ripping it out, but pinioning her whole body around it as she did, swinging around the primal like a pole and letting the motion rake her nails through its neck, then riding it to the ground, which she rebounded off like those little rubber superballs Bran had loved to bounce around as a kid, launched herself into the back of the 3rd, shoving it forward so hard that it toppled into the 4th, taking both of them down right at Bran's feet. Kat hugged the back of the one she'd tackled, claws embedding in its belly, then ripped her hands back, disemboweling it. Bran shot the 4th in the head, swung his pistol up, saw Khan and Elijah thrashing the hell out of each other with such ferocity they looked like a tornado, howling and snarling, bits and pieces of both of them flying off every which way as they clawed and bit and pummeled each other, splattering the floor with the blood they shared. To the right of that maelstrom, Jacob and Abed had tackled a primal to the ground and were doing exactly what Kat had taught them. Going for the throat, little Jacob's innocent face now all twisted up and painted with red. To the left, Shad's jaws were latched onto the face of another, his body curled up and his legs kicking at its stomach, his clawed toes opening it up from sternum to pelvis. Mish tried to take the back of yet another, but was slung off and smashed into a pile of pews. The primal he'd attacked lunged for him, but another earth-shattering blast from Patrick's lever action took it sidelong through the chest, in under one armpit, then spewing heart and lungs out the other side. Bran raised his pistol to the back of the sanctuary, aware that there were still a dozen or so primals back there, but when he sighted at them, he saw something that stilled him. They weren't moving. And now neither were Cat and the boys. Everyone was watching the whirlwind of destruction in the center of the sanctuary. Khan and Elijah never disconnected from each other for a single second, rolling and kicking and toppling over and over each other, smashing the pews to wooden splinters, punching, gouging, slashing, ripping, their dark skin shredded to ribbons, feet slipping on bloody stone tiles, their bodies nearly indistinguishable from each other, save for the slight size difference. But despite all the damage Elijah was giving out, it was oh so clear he was taking more. "I don't have a shot!" Patrick screamed, face pressed to his buttstock, the muzzle of his rifle jerking about, following the hectic scramble of limbs before them. "Me neither!" Bran shouted back. Cat made a move to join the fight. Bran saw her little jerk in that direction and yelled for all he was worth. "Cat, no!" Not because he thought she would get hurt, though that was a real possibility, and not because he didn't want to help Elijah, because he did, but he knew for a certainty that the only reason the crowd of primals at the back of the sanctuary wasn't finishing them off was because this was not about them anymore. Not about the hunt, not about the humans or the hybrids. This was about Khan and Elijah. This was about two alpha males. This was a fight for dominance. And if Cat or Bran or any of them got involved, then the moment would break. The primals would rush them and inevitably overpower them. There were just too many of them. Too many for even Cat. But then again, what would happen if Khan won? And right when he had that thought, Khan managed to duck a swipe from Elijah that Bran was sure would have taken the bigger male's jaw clean off if it had connected. Elijah was too tired, too bloodied, too wounded. He didn't have the quickness he needed. He overshot Khan, and the bigger male took him in the side, toppling him to the ground. They rolled. Khan on his back now, with Elijah face up on top of him. Khan wrapped his thick thighs around Elijah as quick as a snake coiling around its prey. It almost looked like two fighters, one about to complete a rear-naked choke on the other, except that one of Khan's hands had its claws sunk into Elijah's ribs, and the other was reaching inexorably up towards Elijah's throat, held at bay by both of Elijah's weakening arms, giving ground inch by terrible inch. Khan sunk his teeth into Elijah's trapezius muscle, and Elijah screamed, his arms giving way just a bit more. Then someone else was shrieking right along with Elijah. Shay launched herself off of the stage, candlestand-turned spear thrust out in front of her. "Don't!" was all Bran had time to yelp. He tried to snatch a hand to catch her, but only whiffed through empty air as Shay crossed the distance in two bounding strides, raising the candlestand over her head. Then she paused for the briefest of moments. Khan looked up at her, his teeth still buried to the gums in Elijah's flesh. Then she drove the jagged end of that candlestand straight through Khan's eye. Khan gave not a twitch nor a tremble, simply went slack, dead instantaneously. Terror gripped Bran as he jerked the muzzle of his pistol up to the primals amassed at the far end. 15, maybe 20 of them. Too many to shoot, too many to fight. They would surge forward and they would swarm them, overwhelm them. These were the last seconds of Bran's life, he realized, and he hated how much he feared that end, not simply his imminent death, but that it would be so terrible. Why couldn't he have caught a bullet? Why couldn't he have died literally any other way than this? He wished, for just a fleeting moment, that he'd died back in the valley, like he should have, like he deserved. And he did deserve it. But Bran wouldn't wish this coming death on anybody. The universe was a cruel, spiteful thing, to give him these last several weeks, to make him hope, only to snatch it from him in such a god-awful way. And in that little slice of time, Bran considered putting the pistol to his own temple, because if he was going to die, he'd vastly prefer to go on his own terms. But The primals at the far end were not attacking. On the ground in the middle of the sanctuary, Elijah groaned and rolled off of Khan. He came to hands and knees, but seemed unable to go any further. His chest heaved. Blood seeped from dozens of wounds dribbling on the stones beneath him. Shay still had both hands on the candlestand with which she'd spiked Khan's head. Her chest was heaving too. She looked up at the creatures standing motionless across from her. Did she recognize any of them? Did any of them recognize her? Then she screamed at them. "I'm the fucking Alpha!" She ripped the candlestand from Khan's head. "I'm the fucking Omega!" She shook the spear at them with one hand, and with the other she beat her chest to the rhythm of her words. "I'm the fucking Queen Bitch!" She stepped over Khan's dead body, now putting herself between the pack and her own son. "And this is my house!" Kat stepped up to Shay's side, her body tense, arms held out wide, fingers splayed and curled, ready for any challenger. Then she spoke to those primals using the only form of communication they seemed to understand, a sharp, rasping bark, commanding, authoritative, daring anyone to question it. Elijah rose slowly to his feet. His whole body shook, but he managed to straighten, breathing hard. Then he made the same noise. Then Shad and Mish and Abed came in, standing beside their mother and brother. And lastly, always just a bit late to the party, little Jacob. All of them making that strange, throaty bark right along with Kat. The primals didn't break and run. They were not afraid of this display, but they respected it. They respected the rules ingrained into their own instincts. After all, the one who kills the Alpha is the Alpha. And this new Alpha didn't want them here anymore. The new Alpha had her own pack and her own territory, and they were trespassing on it. The hybrids went silent, their point made. And slowly, carefully, as animals will do when they cautiously extract themselves from a fight they no longer want, the primals backed away. None of them turned their backs as they sidled to the breached windows, though all of them bared their teeth. But there was no threat in those bared teeth. Just a warning. You are fierce. I am fierce too. So let's leave each other alone. You go your way and I'll go mine. Then, one by one, they crawled through the windows until the last of them had disappeared, and it was only the hybrids left in the sanctuary, and the 3 humans, and the bodies of the dead, the biggest among them that of Khan. Big Black. The Alpha that had terrorized this region of the Oregon wilderness for so many years, but was Alpha no longer. Chapter 20. Patrick stood in complete disbelief, his rifle still shouldered, as though the moment might reverse itself and all those infected that had just slipped through the windows would come pouring back in. Had that really just happened? All of it, from beginning to end, left Patrick shell-shocked so bad that for a long moment he didn't move, every iota of his bandwidth taken up by trying to reorder his worldview to accept what he just witnessed. Those infected. Patrick knew they were clever, but they'd planned that entry into the sanctuary. They'd planned it like an assault, breaching every window at once. And those hybrids, they hadn't turned on the humans trying to protect them. They hadn't been overwhelmed by their animal instincts like Patrick had thought. He'd figured they'd hear the barking and howling from the other infected and some internal switch would get flipped and they'd go into attack mode. And they kind of had, but not at the humans. Those hybrids had fought the infected, and then convinced them to leave. It was as though there was a whole world of rules that governed these creatures that Patrick had been completely unaware of until that very moment. Holy shit, Patrick breathed and finally broke from his paralysis. He glanced to his left and found Bran there, looking at him strangely. He still had that pistol in his hand, and the way he'd bladed his body to Patrick and the hard glint in his eyes seemed to be asking the question, so what are you going to do now? Patrick stared back, wondering the same damn thing. A small part of him whispered in the back of his mind, just clean him up. I'm pretty sure I can down all these hybrids before they get to me. But no, he couldn't do that. He'd given his word, and he'd sworn it on his daughters. And even if he hadn't, could he really be so low as to kill these beings that were the only reason he was still breathing at that moment? Bran seemed to relax as he saw this change come over Patrick. Patrick turned back to the hybrids and the woman named Shay and the huge body of Big Black lying dead on the floor. The one named Cat turned and looked at Big Black. She seemed suddenly casual about the whole thing. Shay turned as well, and then they all did, all standing there in a semicircle, staring down at the body of the Big Alpha. The one named Elijah, the one that Patrick had mistaken for Big Black, leaned into Shay. He put an arm around her shoulder, somewhat awkwardly, as though physical affection did not come naturally to him. He hugged her, and she hugged him back. Then the little one named Jacob squeezed in and wrapped his curiously muscled arms around her waist. Kat looked at Shay.
See?
She motioned to the hybrids.
They didn't become Khan. They're still your boys.
Trembling now, Shay nodded.
I know. They're still my boys.
Kat pointed to the body on the floor.
Khan was violent and bad. We are violent and good.
Khan. Big Black. Patrick wondered what he felt in that moment. It was hard to suss out. He'd had so many expectations of what it would be like to finally see that beast dead, and he supposed that a part of him was satisfied, relieved, but really he'd expected to feel stronger about it. Mostly, he just felt exhausted, like he'd been running for the last 3 years and just now had finally come to a stop. Everything that had animated his actions over the years, the fear, the anger, the hatred, they all just bled out of him, left him feeling normal, like he had before his daughters had been taken from him. He stepped down off the stage, his grip on his rifle relaxing, letting it hang lazily from one hand. He crossed the few yards to the side of the body, looking down at it, felt that old Coke bottle cap in his pocket. A lucky charm after all, because there was no reason he should be alive right now. He half expected Big Black to come alive and lurch to his feet. Could he really be dead? After all this time? After all the effort that Patrick had put into tracking him down? Patrick realized he felt a little empty at that moment, a little bereft. What was his purpose now? Keep people safe, sure. But how would he do that now, knowing what he knew? The infected were still a threat, would still need to be tracked down and dealt with, he supposed. But here, in the middle of the wilderness between O'Brien and Winchuck, well, someone else was handling this area. He looked up at Elijah. It was you all along, wasn't it? Elijah, fatigued to the point of falling over and apparently only kept upright by Shay, frowned at him, confused. You really were keeping them at bay? Elijah seemed to realize what he meant and nodded once. Shay fixed Patrick with a slightly acidic gaze.
The only reason they came back at all was because you shot him and he was laid up. It was his scent in the woods that kept them away.
Patrick swallowed. I didn't know.
Well, now you do.
Shay's eyes flashed to the others, her hand going down and stroking Jacob's head.
My boys aren't animals. They're smart, thinking people, and they're not a threat to you.
Then she actually looked at them, made eye contact with each of them, and gave them a shaky smile that had a bit of reluctant pride in it.
Yes, they can be violent, just like we all can be. But they're good. They've got good hearts.
And all Patrick could do in response was nod. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Patrick turned and found Bran there. Yeah? We should see if any of your people survived. Bran stepped cautiously out of the sanctuary, pistol held ready. He supposed a part of him still just couldn't believe that the primals had up and retreated like that. Kept expecting there to be some sudden turnaround that he hadn't foreseen, and then the whole pack of them would come roaring back in to finish what they'd started. Out onto the packed dirt and gravel, the sun blazing down on him, insects keening loudly from the woods, a few hesitant bird calls that seemed to be asking, is it over? Can we come out again? There was no movement, no lurking pack of primals lying in wait, and no wailing survivors either, no one begging for help or groaning from their injuries. Where the hell was everyone? Had they all been slaughtered in so short a time? Kat brushed confidently around Bran, her neck somewhat extended, scenting the air.
Come,
she said, starting off.
I can find them.
Patrick stepped forward and caught her by the arm. The movement was quick and took everyone by surprise, and they all just kind of froze, ready for violence to break out again as Kat spun on the other man. Before she could get any ideas, he held up his hand. "Easy, but I think I should go first." Kat's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Patrick seemed uncomfortable with the question. "Because if they see you first, they might think you're one of them and start shooting." He swallowed, then added quietly, "If there are any left alive." Kat regarded him for another moment, then jerked her head towards the courtyard. "There are. I can smell them. Still alive. Still sweating fear." A bit of tension came out of Patrick's shoulders. Relief, which he seemed to immediately temper, guarding his expectations, not wanting to get his hopes up too much. After all, Kat couldn't tell him how many were still alive, just that she could smell someone still exuding that fear sweat. "Where?" Patrick said, striding forward of Kat. "The garden," she said. "On the other side. In a room, I think." Patrick moved forward, followed immediately by Kat. Bran, Shay, and the boys trailed behind. The courtyard garden had been thrashed. Tomato cages toppled, the plants smashed, the fruits crushed. Loose soil scattered everywhere. The bed of potatoes had been trampled through, the stands of foliage laid flat, looking sad and wounded. Splashes of blood everywhere, on the pale gravel and splattering the greenery and across the adobe walls. And yet... Patrick pulled to a stop, looking this way and that. Where are all the bodies? Kat gave him an odd look, like the answer was obvious and he should have understood it already. She waited for him to see her look and for a breath of dark comprehension to come to his features. "They took them," Kat said simply. Bran's stomach turned and his grip tightened on the pistol, wondering how Patrick was going to take the news that, even though the Primals had chosen to leave them be, they weren't passing up the meals they'd earned on the way in. Patrick stared for a time, then nodded stiffly. Turned, continued on through the decimated garden. Bran frowned around, realizing that it wasn't just the people the Primals had killed that were missing. "They took their own dead, too?" he wondered aloud, glancing at Kat. She only gave him a shrug. Christ, did they eat their own kind, too? Or was this some sort of social thing? Did they put all their dead in one spot, like an elephant graveyard? He'd never witnessed that type of behavior before, or even heard about it. As they wound their way through the garden to the dormitories, Bran realized something. He'd been thinking about the Primals all wrong. He'd been thinking of them as, well, a finished product. But that's not how evolution worked, was it? Every creature was constantly changing and adapting, and the Primals were creatures that were still in a wildly active state of macroevolution. All the time, they were changing and adapting and doing it quite rapidly, determinedly carving out a place for themselves in a world that didn't want them there. One could say that they didn't belong, that they weren't natural, but they'd happened. They were here, and Bran didn't think they were going anywhere. Even as he felt he understood them slightly better with that dawning realization, it also terrified him. Because, in a way, both Patrick and Shay were right. There was a chance that the hybrids could be socialized, could learn to live alongside humans. Shay's monastery, or home for wayward hybrids as she'd called it, was proving that. But it was an experiment that was still ongoing. No one knew if it would work out in the long run, or if others could even be convinced to see the hybrids as people. But Patrick also had a point. The Primals were a threat to the survival of every human being on this planet, not just because of their tendency to treat humans as a primary source of prey, but because they bred so damn fast. Their populations were exploding all across the country, and Bran had to assume it was much the same all across the world. And at the same time that they were growing more and more numerous, the population of human beings was dwindling. There was a term for that, Bran knew. He wasn't a very educated man, but he'd done some reading while in prison, and the name for that evolutionary concept came back to him with surprising clarity: selection pressure. In a hostile environment, an organism either adapts and flourishes, or they fail to adapt and go extinct. The Primals were flourishing, the humans were failing, and that scared the shit out of Bran. They entered the covered walkway that surrounded the courtyard, on the other side of which were all the dormitory doors. And by then, Bran could hear the survivors clear enough. Someone was crying softly, while two others were speaking rapidly in low tones. He couldn't tell what they were saying, but could intuit it well enough. They were wondering if the coast was clear. Patrick made sure to position himself in front of Kat, then raised his voice. "It's Patrick! The infected are gone! It's safe to come out!" The murmurs and weeping stopped. A long silence ensued, and just when Bran thought maybe they were too scared to come out and would need some further convincing, one of the dormitory doors rattled. Sounded like a chair was being removed from where it had been used to brace the door. Then it opened and a woman's face emerged, eyes wide and severe and suspicious. She saw Patrick, and Kat, and the other hybrids. Bran deliberately put his body between the woman and the boys, while Patrick held his hand up to her, trying to forestall a bad reaction. "It's okay," Patrick said quickly as the woman's face flashed into terror. "Rita, it's okay. They're not going to hurt you. They're, Patrick glanced back at them. "Friendly."
What the fuck?
The woman breathed. Rita, apparently. She looked ready to slam the door in their faces.
Aren't they the ones?
Patrick cut her off. "We made a mistake. Okay, Rita? I made a mistake. And the only reason we're still alive right now is because of them. Because they fought the infected off. And they talk. They talk and they think." He took a careful step towards Rita, who was now just staring at the hybrids like she couldn't comprehend a word that was coming out of Patrick's mouth. "They're people." Rita shook her head.
No.
Patrick spoke sternly, almost a command. "They are, and I gave them my word that I wouldn't hurt them. And that goes for you too, because I was the one that brought you here." Another step towards her, this one more confident. "We are not going to hurt these people." Rita was still highly unsure. Her face twisted up and started glancing around over their shoulders.
What about Big Black? I saw him. I swear to God, I saw him, Patrick. He was here.
Her gaze locked on Elijah, pure animal aggression born out of fear.
He looked just like him.
One final step and Patrick was nearly at the door. "Big Black is dead." Rita blinked in disbelief.
He's dead?
Patrick twisted and nodded at Shay and Elijah, who were still linked together, Shay still supporting most of his weight. "They killed him." For the first time, Rita seemed to see past Elijah's mutated face and actually saw his multitude of bleeding injuries, cuts and slashes and vicious bite marks all over his body. And when the two of them made eye contact with each other, Elijah and the woman named Rita who had come all this way to kill him, it seemed to Bran that maybe Rita understood that she was speaking to an actual person and not a savage beast to be afraid of.
You?
Rita husked.
You killed him?
Elijah shook his head slowly. "I fought him," the big boy struggled out. Rita pulled back as though shocked to hear him speak English. Elijah nodded to Shay. "She killed him." Patrick reached out, moving slow, as though not to spook the woman, and placed his hand gently on the door she was still holding mostly closed. "They're on our side, Rita. They're not the enemy. Big Black was the enemy, and they took him down for us. Finally. He's never going to take anyone else's family from them. Trust me, Rita. You're safe." Rita stared at him and slowly gave way to his gentle pressure on the door, pushing it open. Patrick looked inside, his expression clenched. "How many are in there with you?" Rita moved slightly to the side of the door frame. Through it, Bran could just make out two others inside, two men. One lying on the bed, bleeding all over the sheets and whimpering, holding a limp arm to his chest that seemed to have had the shoulder muscle nearly ripped off. The other man stood protectively over the wounded man, some sort of AK shouldered, but not pointing at anyone in particular.
"Just me and Todd and Yuri,"
Rita murmured, her voice sounding clenched. The one with the AK caught sight of Bran and stiffened, frowning. Patrick moved into the doorway, hands still upraised, still trying to keep the peace. "Yuri, hold your fire." "Did you hear what I told Rita?" Yuri blinked, hands working at his rifle. "Is it true?" "Which part?" Yuri's mouth worked without words for a moment, then he managed to spill them out. "All of it. Big Black and the hybrids. Yeah, it's true." Patrick seemed to hesitate, turning his attention to the other man bleeding all over the bed. We need to get Todd back to Doc Brown. Shay made a move forward. Kat had retreated at that point and stepped up to Elijah's other side, taking his weight while Shay disconnected.
I have some medical supplies.
Patrick regarded her for a moment, but then shook his head. That's kind of you to offer. He nodded towards Elijah. But he needs help too. You take care of him. We'll take care of our own. A slight grimace worked its way across his features. Probably best if we don't hang around. And Bran thought he knew what was being left unsaid. This peace between his people and Shay's was fragile. Everyone's emotions were on a hair trigger now. It would only take one mistake, one misinterpretation born of fear, and the rickety truce would devolve into another panic of bloodshed. Shay must have understood that too, because she nodded. Rita spoke up again.
Where's everyone else?
She said it so quiet, Bran thought she already knew the truth, just didn't want to admit it to herself. Patrick only looked at her and slowly shook his head. She gave no obvious reaction, but Bran could see the confirmation of her fears, could see how her eyes tightened while the rest of her face went slack, and he wondered who all she'd lost that day. Just comrades? Or were some of them friends? Perhaps a lover in there? Patrick strode further into the room, his movements slow and unwieldy with exhaustion, both mental and physical. Now that the moment wasn't so fueled by adrenaline, Patrick's busted knee became apparent again as he favored it, limping. He made to help Yuri pull the wounded man off the bed, but Rita saw his lame leg and went over.
I got him, Pat,
she said quietly. And then, without another word, the 4 survivors of the 24 men and women that had come to exterminate the hybrids slowly shuffled out. Kat moved Elijah off to the side. Shad, Mish, Abed, and Jacob cleared a path, giving the foursome a wide berth. The wounded man whimpered and cringed away from them, but Rita, Yuri, and Patrick kept their eyes forward. Bran and Shay followed them out. They'd taken 5 vehicles to get here. One was smashed into the front entrance of the monastery, clearly not drivable. Another had been abandoned on the far side of the courtyard, near the stone bench that overlooked the garden. Some panicked asshole had driven it straight through the garden, contributing to the wreckage of Shay's hard work. Hell, all their hard work. Bran felt a little miffed about that, and then realized that he really had come to think of this place as his home. The remaining 3 vehicles were still out near the edge of the woods. Bran and Shay stood in the monastery's entrance, watching in silence as the 4 people split themselves among the 3 vehicles, Rita and Patrick each taking one, then Yuri taking the third with the wounded Todd in the back seat. The engines started up. The vehicles moved about as slow as the people had, like the machines were as dazed as their drivers. 2 of the vehicles cut tight U-turns and headed back down the path through the woods that would lead to the road a few miles distant. But one ambled towards Bran and Shay. It was Patrick. He pulled the vehicle into a turn, bringing his open driver's side window around to face them. Both hands clutching the steering wheel, Patrick looked uncertain, seemed uncomfortable with making eye contact with them, and mostly stared at his own hands. I know I don't got a right to ask anything of you. Shay's mouth tightened with restrained anger, but she shook her head.
You made a stupid mistake, but you paid for it.
Patrick's throat bobbed, and he dared to cast his gaze on Shay, only holding eye contact for a moment before glancing away again. I'll need to come back for that vehicle. The one in your garden. Bran stiffened as he saw Shay's nostrils flare a bit. Patrick might have paid a high cost for his stupidity, and all of Shay's boys had survived. But that didn't make forgiving the other man any easier, and Shay likely didn't really want to see his face again anytime soon. Bran touched Shay lightly on her wrist to keep her from saying something she might regret. Then he nodded to Patrick. I'll drive it out of here. Leave it down on the road for you. Thank you, Patrick murmured, staring at his steering wheel again. But he didn't drive off. Something else? Bran prompted, a little warily. I'm sorry about your garden. Bran almost laughed at him. Seemed a ridiculous thing to apologize for after all the other shit Patrick had pulled. But he restrained himself, and only because of how earnest Patrick had said it. We run trading caravans along that road, Patrick continued. Every day, an hour after daylight and an hour before dark. If you ever want to trade with us... He trailed off, leaving the invitation open-ended. Shay issued a soft snort.
So the two settlements that were frothing at the mouth to kill us are now just going to welcome us with open arms?
Patrick looked at her, unflinching. No, not right away. But you keep hiding out here, you'll only ever be a stranger to be feared. It might take some time, but if you let people get to know you a bit, well, they'll eventually get used to you. Eventually, stop being afraid. He sighed heavily and kind of slumped in his seat. Like it or not, we're in this together. And if we're gonna survive... He glanced between them. Shit, we gotta start somewhere. And then he drove off, the tail end of his vehicle and the growling of the engine slowly disappearing into the forests of the Oregon wilderness. Epilogue. The days had grown short and cold, and the nights had grown longer and even colder. Not full-on winter just yet, but getting there. A lot of evergreens in these woods, but the deciduous trees had changed. They'd offered up bright splashes of autumn color for a few weeks and were now shedding their leaves almost bare. Bran moved quietly through the woods with a heavy pack on his back and the AR rifle slung to his chest. The attack on the monastery 3 months prior hadn't been a total loss. Yeah, their garden had gotten fucked up good and solid, but honestly, it hadn't taken them that long to put most of it right again, and in the doing, they'd found some leftovers from the fight hiding in amongst trampled greenery. So now Bran had a rifle, and so did Shay, plus 3 others and 2 pistols. She didn't seem to care for it all that much, but Shay's rifle was never very far away from her grasp, and she'd forbade Bran to teach the boys how to shoot. That was okay. Baby steps. Bran was just happy to be armed again. And frankly, neither the boys nor Kat seemed overly eager to learn how to use firearms. They were content to use their teeth and claws if the situation called for violence. But they hadn't needed to. Elijah had healed up after a few weeks of sullen bed rest mandated by Shay. Those had been some tense weeks, always the concern that the primals would come back with some new alpha male in charge, since Elijah wasn't maintaining his territorial claim. Several times while raiding the old orchards for walnuts, Bran had spotted signs of them, tracks that looked like they'd been left by a barefoot human, save for the indent of claws at the point of each toe, and twice he'd actually seen the primals themselves, though at a distance, but they never came back to the monastery. Still, it was always best to be cautious, so when Bran was out and about, as he was now, he always had either Kat or Elijah with him. Today he had both. Kat up front, moving almost soundlessly through the forest, and Elijah taking up the rear just as quiet. They'd gotten close, those two, and that made Bran wildly uncomfortable. Had a lot of whispered conversations with Shay about it. So far, they hadn't caught Elijah or Kat doing anything more than just hanging around and talking. Their speech greatly improved with the constant practice. But they couldn't keep an eye on them all the time, and teenagers were wily bastards, which is what Elijah and Kat were, essentially. Raging fucking hormones and all that. It was only a matter of time before Kat broke her promise of no rutting, and there wasn't shit Bran could do about it. What could he do? Put her in a chastity belt? And besides all that, Bran couldn't exactly preach celibacy, not without being a hypocrite anyways. One fine autumn morning, only a few weeks back, Kat had approached the stone bench where Bran and Shay were sitting in a comfortable, amiable silence. Maybe she'd had something else on her mind, but when she reached them, she stopped, frowned, then scented the air. Bran and Shay exchanged a self-conscious glance. Kat narrowed her eyes at the both of them, still sniffing at them.
You,
she said, pointing at the two of them, her eyes going wide.
You rutted!
Bran's face had flushed hot, and he'd stammered about for some bullshit to throw at Kat like chaff, but any attempt to lie about it was ruined by Shay, who suddenly devolved into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. Kat had simply shaken her head at them, like she was the disappointed parent that had caught 2 kids with their hands in each other's pants. Bran didn't care for the sudden role reversal. As Kat had turned and started walking away, and Shay continued trying to muffle her own laughter with both hands over her face, Bran had called out, a bit defensively, "We're adults!" To which Kat had responded,
"So am I!"
"No, you're not!" Bran shouted, sounding dishearteningly juvenile in his own ears. Kat had not dignified that with a response. Still wheezing breathlessly, Shay had laid a hand on his thigh and croaked out through tear-streaked eyes,
Technically.
So, yeah. When it came to Elijah and Kat, Bran figured it was just a matter of time. Following behind Kat as they wound their way through the forest, Bran saw the trees open up ahead, the glimmer of morning sunlight on the narrow strip of asphalt that hadn't been swallowed by encroaching dirt. The relationship between the monastery and the two settlements of O'Brien and Winchuck was still a little tense, though no longer directly hostile. They were, at the very least, no longer strangers, and just like Patrick had said, over the last couple months of making weekly trips to one or the other, the people of O'Brien and Winchuck had slowly started to get used to Bran and Shay. As their familiarity grew, their fear faded, and the animosity faded with it. It wasn't all hunky-dory just yet. There were still quite a few people that refused to interact with either Bran or Shay, and gave them caustic glares should their eyes happen to meet. But more and more others were welcoming them. At first, simply willing to trade, and then to pass a greeting, and most recently to actually smile at Bran when they saw him. But at the same time, none of the hybrids were welcome, a fact that seemed to bother Kat to no end, though Elijah took it in stride. Maybe there would come a day when Bran could bring Kat along with him without fear of violence breaking out, but that day was not today. Baby steps. Kat and Elijah took up positions behind Bran, so they were concealed in the brush by the side of the road. Bran shucked off his heavy pack and stood in clear view. The folks in the caravan were aware that Kat and Elijah escorted Bran for his protection. There were still packs of primals roaming the area, but Bran figured it was best not to flaunt the hybrids in their faces. His pack rattled dully as he plopped it on the ground. As it turned out, not many folks from Winchuck or O'Brien had the balls to wander too far out from their settlements, so they hadn't come across the abandoned orchards that the hybrids freely picked from. Apparently, walnuts were a big fucking deal, which was good for Bran and Shay, because Jacob was rapidly outgrowing his clothes. Kid had hit some sort of growth spurt. He seemed happy enough to run around with his pecker hanging out, but that was just a bit too much for Shay, and a new pair of pants was called for, as well as some sort of jacket with winter coming on. Bran wasn't sure what his backpack full of walnuts would get him, but he was pretty sure he could secure a pair of pants and a jacket at the very least. Bran didn't have to wait very long. He'd only been standing there for about 5 minutes before he heard the distant grumble of engines. He looked east and found the caravan from O'Brien coming into view. He stood patiently by the roadside as the vehicles approached. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop in front of Bran. Patrick was riding what he still referred to as bitch patrol in the pickup bed. "Morning," Bran called up as he hefted the pack onto one shoulder again. Patrick had a weird look to his eyes today, and Bran kind of slowed, hesitating as he approached the truck bed. He put his hand on the sidewall but didn't clamber up in. Patrick glanced into the brush. "Cat with you today?" Bran tensed a little bit, peered up at Patrick. "Something wrong?" "No," Patrick said distractedly, then turned and looked behind them at the other vehicles idling on the road. 2 cars down. You see that white pickup?" Still not sure what the hell was going on, Bran looked and saw a white pickup truck that seemed somehow vaguely familiar to him. He wasn't sure why, though. It looked like any other white pickup truck. "Yeah, okay," Bran said uncertainly. "I see it." Glancing up. "What's this about, Patrick?" In response, Patrick looked at the truck and waved an arm. That appeared to be some sort of signal, and Bran was just keyed up enough at that point that his hand slipped off the side of the pickup bed and touched the grip of his rifle. The front passenger's door of that white pickup opened, and a man stepped out. "Was hoping I could find you, Bran," a rough but cheerful voice called. Bran stared at the man like he was a ghost. Tall, thin but muscular, wearing armor with a rifle strapped to his chest and a pistol on his side. As he approached, grinning amiably at the gobsmacked Bran, he displayed a severe limp, and his left eye just a puckered mess of scar tissue. "Guy said he knows you," Patrick explained, sounding almost apologetic, like he wasn't sure if he just royally fucked Bran over by bringing the man to him. "You all right, Bran?" Then lower, "Is this guy dangerous?" To which Bran could only croak, "Yes." Patrick stiffened, both hands on his rifle. Despite being completely on the back foot, Bran saw Patrick's movement in his peripheral and held up a hand. "Don't." The man stopped, only a single stride from Bran, still smiling. "Jax," Bran husked. "How the fuck did you find me?" The man named Jack shrugged his wide shoulders. You know how it is. Word gets around. Rumors circulate like the flu, from one settlement to another. So imagine my immense surprise when I hear the tales of a guy that has a part human, part primal girl as his companion. Jax's brow cinched down a bit and he glanced around. "Is Kat with you now?" Bran didn't know why Jax was here and whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, which is a pretty reasonable way to feel when facing the man that had damn near killed you, but then, for some weird reason, decided to save your life, bandage your wounds, and let you go when you should have been turned over to the rabid vengeance of the people you'd been hurting for years. Because of all that, Bran briefly considered lying about Kat's whereabouts. He didn't get the chance, though. Kat rose up from where she'd been hunkered in the brush. Jax didn't seem surprised, actually smiled and waved at her. "There you are, Kat. How've you been?" Kat quirked her head to one side, stepped clear of the brush.
Jax, what are you doing here?
Jax pulled his head back and glanced at Bran. Damn, her speech has gotten better. Kat pressed forward even more, repeating her question in a slightly more demanding voice, and then Jax's face became suddenly very serious. "I'll tell you what," he said slowly, every word seeming carefully considered. "Let me give you all a ride out to Windchuck. I can fill you in on the details while we go. And if for whatever reason you're not on board with what I have to offer by the time we get to Windchuck, then there's no hard feelings. I'll drive you right back here and we can go our separate ways. But..." Jax paused for a long moment, his single eye fixing specifically on Kat. "The long and short of it is, I need some help. There's something me and my team have to do, and our chances of success would be greatly improved with your help, and frankly, our chances of survival too." He turned that one eye on Bran. "We got room for you too, Bran, if you're interested. But really, it's Kat that I need." Back to her, his voice earnest, and deadly, deadly serious. "Kat, I need you on my team for this mission. I need a hybrid." Bran was tempted to turn him down right then and there without even hearing the details. After all, he'd finally made a life for himself, finally had a home, a place to live in peace. But living peacefully had always been a strain for Kat, and even just the possibility of being let loose again made everything in Kat's face change. She looked like this might be the best day of her life. She looked like she was being offered freedom. And she smiled, showing her teeth.
Okay.
This has been an Audible Studios production of Sanctuary, written by DJ Molay, performed by Christian Rummel, executive producer, Catherine Stewart, producer, Thomas Mann, edited and mastered by Real Audiobooks, head of production at Audible Studios, Mike Charzik, copyright 2023 by DJ Molay, sound recording copyright 2023 by Audible Inc. Audible Studios is a division of Audible Inc.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.